For a pivotal 30-year stretch, the United States didn't just influence Latin America, it basically remade the entire Western Hemisphere in its own image. So what we're going to do is explore the story of how a strategy of open, brute force eventually gave way to something far more subtle and, well, maybe far more effective. And the whole thing really kicks off with a massive paradox. And this quote here, wow, it just nails it. You've got Woodrow Wilson, the great idealist, the champion of letting every nation decide its own destiny, and yet he turns out to be the most interventionist president in the hemisphere's history. It's a fascinating and pretty wild contradiction.
So that brings us to the big question, right? The US starts out with this really heavy hand. We're talking Marines, we're talking financial takeovers, but that kind of strategy, it just couldn't last. So how did they adapt? How did they manage to shift from an iron fist to more of a velvet glove, all while keeping that same tight grip on power?
Let's start with that first phase, what we can call the era of direct domination. This was a time when US control was totally out in the open, it was unapologetic, and it was absolutely backed by military force, all under the watch of that so-called idealist president, Woodrow Wilson.
Okay, and what's just wild is the sheer pace of it all. I mean, look at this timeline. In just a handful of years, boom, the US takes control of Nicaragua's finances. Boom, the Navy occupies a major port in Mexico. Then they land Marines in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And they send troops back into Cuba. The Caribbean was, for all intents and purposes, turned into what the source material calls an American lake.
And we're not just talking about abstract policy here. This was boots on the ground. This picture really brings it home. You've got General Pershing, and hey, check that out, a young George S. Patton right behind him, deep inside Mexico. The U.S. military presence wasn't just some distant threat. It was a visible, everyday reality for people. But it wasn't just about soldiers and guns. Working right alongside the military was an incredibly powerful economic weapon: dollar diplomacy. The idea behind it was pretty straightforward, really. Use America's huge financial power to control its neighbors. You make sure they're stable, you make sure they're friendly, and most importantly, you make sure they're open for American business.
So, hand in hand with military muscle came this massive economic takeover. And the First World War, well, that was the big catalyst. As Europe just got completely consumed by the conflict, it left this huge economic vacuum in Latin America, and you can bet the United States was more than ready to jump in and fill it.
And the numbers here are just staggering. I mean, look at this. U.S. investment goes from about $320 million in 1898 to $1.7 billion by 1914. And then it just explodes to $5.4 billion by 1929. American money completely pushed out the once dominant British and other European investors. So what did all this actually look like on the ground? Well, let's just take Cuba as a perfect case study. The island's entire economy became tied to one single thing: sugar. And as all that American investment poured in, that tie became less of a partnership and more like a chain. And this chart, man, it really drives the point home. Think about it. Over 3/4 of all Cuban sugar came from mills owned by Americans. And where did all that sugar go? A whopping 80% of Cuba's exports went straight to the United States. Cuba's entire economic fate was now being decided in American boardrooms. And that's the crucial takeaway here. The source material really doesn't mince words. This overwhelming economic control didn't create a partnership. It created what's described as a system of abject dependence. Okay, so you have this model of direct, heavy-handed control, but a system like that, well, it just couldn't last forever. By the late 1920s and early 30s, the cracks were really starting to show. That big stick policy was becoming a major liability. So why the change of heart? Well, for one, you had this rise of nationalism across Latin America. Mexico, for example, started to push back hard, nationalizing its oil reserves. There was also just a ton of growing resentment against the US and its so-called right to intervene. But maybe the biggest pressure was external. I mean, how could the US go on the world stage and condemn Japanese expansion in Manchuria while its own Marines were occupying places like Haiti and Nicaragua? The hypocrisy was just becoming impossible to defend. And all that pressure forced a major pivot. So enter Franklin D. Roosevelt and his famous good neighbor policy. This was a huge shift in rhetoric and, at least on the surface, in action. That iron fist was getting swapped out for a velvet glove. And you can really see the before and after right here. Before, U.S. policy was all about military intervention and these special treaty rights like the Platt Amendment, which basically gave the U.S. a permission slip to intervene in Cuba whenever it wanted. The new policy? Pulling out troops and officially giving up that right to intervene. It was a massive public reversal. And let me tell you, the U.S. sold this new image hard. This government-produced poster is a perfect example of the huge PR campaign they launched. This was all about rebranding the United States, not as an occupier, but as a friend, a partner, a good neighbor. It was about changing minds, both at home and all across the Americas. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. While the tactics changed dramatically, the fundamental goal, maintaining U.S. supremacy in the hemisphere, that stayed exactly the same. This really marks the beginning of a whole new era, the era of indirect control. So what did this new toolkit look like? Well, instead of sending in the Marines, the U.S. started using strategic loans to create economic dependency. Instead of occupying a country directly, it would train and equip a local military force that would be loyal to U.S. interests. And it would provide financial aid to friendly, even autocratic governments to make sure they stayed in power. And if you want a perfect and honestly tragic example of how this new strategy worked, look no further than Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua. Here was a guy who fought against the U.S. Marine occupation. Eventually, the Marines left, but they left behind a powerful National Guard that they had trained. And very soon after, that same U.S.-backed force assassinated Sandino. The U.S. troops were gone, but their control very much remained. So, in the end, the U.S. swapped gunboats for checkbooks and direct occupation for local proxies. It was a whole new policy, but with the same old goal. And this strategy didn't just end in 1945. Its legacy continues to shape the complex and often really difficult relationship the U.S. has with its neighbors to this day. And it leaves you with a final thought, right? When the velvet glove is just there to conceal an iron fist, is that really being a good neighbor?